The sea has always kept secrets, sometimes holding them for decades before revealing the truth. In 1944, a German submarine known as U-455 disappeared beneath the surface and was never seen again. On board were 50 men, all of whom vanished without a trace. Their families were left with unanswered questions, while the German Navy maintained silence. For 66 long years, there was no sign of the submarine, until divers discovered a strange, twisted shape deep in the Bay of Genoa. Partially buried in mud, its bow raised as though frozen in a final, desperate gasp for air, lay the wreck of U-455. The sight of it raised haunting questions. What exactly happened in those last hours? Did it fall victim to enemy fire? Was it destroyed by a mine? Or was the ocean itself the cause of its doom? Whatever the truth, the story of U-455 became one of tragedy and mystery. During the Second World War, German submarines, known as U-boats, were among the most feared weapons on the seas. The Allies called them the Grey Wolves, because they hunted silently and struck without warning. Nazi propaganda painted them as symbols of German strength and invincibility, showing them as predators that lurked beneath the waves, launching deadly torpedoes before disappearing into the ocean's vast darkness. For the Allies, the thought of U-boats was terrifying. They brought visions of merchant ships exploding into flames, sailors struggling in lifeboats, and entire convoys ripped apart during the night. But life aboard a U-boat was nothing like the glamorous image shown in propaganda. The men who served inside were called an elite group, but what that really meant was that they could endure conditions that were almost unbearable. A typical Type 7C submarine, like U-455, carried about 50 men crammed into a steel tube a little over 220 feet long. There was no sunlight, no fresh air, and no comfort. The air was always filled with the smell of oil, diesel fuel, sweat, and damp clothes. Fresh water was so scarce it was mostly saved for cooking or keeping the machinery working. As a result, the men went unwashed for entire missions that could last weeks. Privacy did not exist. Bunks were shared in shifts, and meals were often eaten while sitting next to torpedoes that were also used as makeshift shelves for supplies. Life on board shifted constantly between long stretches of tense silence and sudden bursts of terror. Sometimes hours would pass with nothing but the steady hum of the engines, until the sound of sonar pings warned that Allied ships were nearby. At those moments, the submarine would dive deeper, the air becoming hotter and harder to breathe, while condensation dripped from the metal walls. The men sat in silence, waiting, as enemy destroyers above dropped depth charges into the water. Each explosion shook the submarine like a toy in a child's hand. The crew never knew if the next blast would tear the steel hull apart. The mental strain was almost as heavy as the physical dangers. Still, these men were told they were Germany's best fighters, the hunters of the deep who brought fear into the hearts of their enemies. In the early years of the war, that reputation seemed to be true. U-boats devastated shipping routes across the Atlantic, threatening to cut off Britain's supply of food, weapons, and fuel. Adolf Hitler believed the submarine campaign was his greatest weapon, the key to forcing the Allies into submission. The German public was told that U-boat crews were heroes. Their victories were shown in newsreels, and their commanders were celebrated as legends. It was in this dangerous world that U-455 began its service. Commissioned in 1941, it was first sent to the cold northern waters around Norway to hunt Allied ships. Those first missions were disappointing, producing little success after weeks of dangerous and uncomfortable patrols. Eventually, U-455 was reassigned to the Atlantic Ocean. There, its crew finally tasted victory when they sank 2 Allied cargo ships, including the British vessel Workman. These successes gave the crew a surge of confidence, making them feel like true predators of the sea rather than helpless prey. There was a time when the men aboard U-455 felt like true hunters of the ocean. They had tasted victory and carried the pride of predators who had drawn blood in the vast, hostile waters. But by 1943, the war at sea had changed. New technology such as advanced radar, sonar, long-range aircraft, and more powerful depth charges turned the oceans into killing grounds for U-boats. The hunters became the hunted, and many submarines simply never returned. Their crews vanished into the deep, their fates unknown, swallowed by the sea. This was the dangerous world that U-455 sailed into, a place filled with pride and fear, with propaganda telling one story and reality telling another. Soon, this submarine and its men would face one of the most perilous missions of the war, entering the Mediterranean through the deadly Strait of Gibraltar. By January 1944, the tide of the war had shifted. The Allies were tightening their control over the Mediterranean, pushing through North Africa and Italy. For the German Navy, this region had become critical. Submarines were ordered to disrupt Allied supply lines, and U-455 was among those selected. On paper, its mission was simple: enter the Mediterranean and attack convoys along the Italian coast. In reality, the task was almost suicidal. To reach that battlefield, the crew would have to cross the Strait of Gibraltar, a narrow passage just 9 miles wide at its tightest point, heavily guarded by Allied ships, aircraft, radar, and minefields. The strait was more than water. It was a fortress. For a submarine, trying to pass through was like threading a needle while blindfolded, all while being hunted from above and below. Many subs that attempted it never made it, their presence betrayed only by oil slicks floating on the surface. For U-455, this crossing meant everything. Success would open the door to their new patrol zone. Failure would mean death in a steel coffin at the bottom of the sea. On a cold evening in January, the crew prepared for the attempt. Hatches were sealed, engines checked, and the submarine slipped beneath the waves. Inside, the atmosphere changed at once. Lights dimmed, conversations dropped to whispers, and the men braced themselves for what might be the most dangerous hours of their lives. For the next 40 hours, silence and discipline would decide whether they lived or died. The submarine moved slowly along the seabed, relying not only on machinery but also on the forces of nature. Strong Atlantic currents rushed into the strait, and Commander Hans-Heinrich Giesler hoped to use them as cover. Every sound inside the submarine carried the weight of life or death. A dropped tool, a wrong move, or raising the periscope too soon could give away their position. Above them, Allied destroyers searched day and night, their sonar operators listening for even the faintest echo. Aircraft circled the skies, ready to strike at the first sign of a wake or an oil trail. To the men below, it felt as though they were crawling beneath a ceiling made of knives, each one ready to fall at any moment. Conditions grew unbearable inside the submarine. Air became thick with carbon dioxide, the heat rose and sweat soaked the men. Every breath carried the taste of diesel fumes. Hunger gnawed at their stomachs, exhaustion weighed down their bodies, and fear pressed heavily on their minds. Still they pressed forward hour by hour, inch by inch, through the underwater gauntlet. After nearly 2 days of suffocating tension, U-455 finally slipped past Gibraltar and into the Mediterranean. Against impossible odds, they had survived. For the crew, it must have felt like a second birth, as though they had beaten fate itself. But survival came with a cruel twist. Their victory would be short-lived. The mission that awaited them in these new waters would become their last. Once clear of Gibraltar, U-455 received new orders from German Naval Command. They were to patrol the Ligurian and Tyrrhenian seas, striking at Allied supply lines feeding into Italy. The Allies, who had landed at Salerno and Anzio, were pressing northward, and every ship carrying food, fuel, and weapons was vital to their advance. The German Navy hoped that submarines like U-455 could slow them down. For the crew, the assignment meant stalking Italy's western coast, searching for convoys, launching torpedoes when the opportunity came, and then vanishing again into the deep. But the Mediterranean in 1944 was no longer a safe hunting ground. Allied aircraft ruled the skies, destroyers prowled the seas, and minefields blocked entire regions. U-455 had made it through Gibraltar alive, but ahead lay a battlefield where luck could not last forever. What had once been a place of opportunity for German submarines had now become a graveyard. By 1944, U-boats were no longer the hunters, they were the hunted. U-455 entered this world of danger, and the last confirmed transmission ever received from it was nothing more than a routine message. It simply acknowledged its new patrol orders. There was nothing unusual in the report, no sign of mechanical trouble, no mention of attack or distress. The submarine was doing its job, and then suddenly it went silent. No more signals came. No requests for help. No further reports. To German Naval Command, it was as if U-455 had vanished into thin air. Weeks turned into months with no word, and eventually the Kriegsmarine declared U-455 missing. Families of the crew were informed through short, cold letters filled with official language but little comfort. These letters carried the unbearable truth that their loved ones, sons, brothers, husbands, were gone. For the German Navy, U-455 was just another number added to the long list of submarines lost in the Mediterranean. But for the families, it was a wound that could never properly heal. There was no grave to visit, no remains to bury, no explanation to hold on to. There was only silence. Speculation about the submarine's fate began almost immediately. Some believed U-455 had been destroyed by German mines laid off the Italian coast, perhaps without proper warning sent to the crews. Others argued that Allied aircraft or destroyers had detected and attacked the vessel. A few thought there may have been an accident, an explosion in the torpedo bay, a sudden engine failure, or some other catastrophe inside the submarine that gave the men no chance of escape. But these ideas remained guesses, because no wreckage was ever found. For decades, U-455's disappearance remained one of the great mysteries of naval history. This silence was more than just a blank in military records. It was a silence that spread into the homes of families who never knew what happened to their loved ones. Unlike sailors lost on surface ships, whose remains or debris sometimes washed ashore, the men of U-455 simply disappeared into the depths. Their grave was the sea itself, locked away from human eyes. Survivors of the U-boat service often spoke of the bond among submariners, a family forged out of the constant presence of steel walls and the constant shadow of death. For the two men who had once served on U-455 but were reassigned before its final mission, the silence was especially haunting. They knew exactly who had been aboard when it left, and they lived with the knowledge that only chance had saved them from sharing that same fate. For 66 years, the mystery endured. Families never had a resting place to visit, historians had no wreck to study, and the ocean guarded its secret. Then, in 2010, everything changed. Off the coast of Genoa, Italian diver Roberto Raldi and his team were exploring the seabed when they came upon a shape that froze them in place. 400 feet beneath the waves, half buried in sand and covered with marine growth, was the unmistakable outline of a submarine. The divers were struck not only by the sight of the wreck but by its posture. The bow was pointed upward, frozen at an angle, as though the submarine had been clawing its way toward the surface in a desperate attempt to survive. It was a haunting image, not the quiet, controlled ruin of a scuttled vessel, but the violent stillness of a ship caught in its final struggle. The hull was coated with coral and sea life, the paint long gone, but the steel skeleton remained, whispering of its identity. At first, the team could not confirm which submarine they had found. No numbers or insignia survived. The sea had erased them. But its silhouette, size, and construction marked it as a German Type 7C. That narrowed the possibilities to only a handful of missing U-boats in the region. The divers were chilled most by one detail. The hatches were sealed. They had not been blown open by escape attempts. The metal had been locked shut, trapping the men inside. This was not just a wreck, it was a tomb. 50 men remained entombed within their steel coffin, their bodies long gone but their final resting place untouched since 1944. Realizing the magnitude of their discovery, the divers brought in naval historians, including Mark and Luke Breyer of the Atlantic Wall Museum. Together they studied wartime records, patrol routes, and survivor testimonies. A crucial discovery came from archives in Freiburg, Germany, which showed that 3 U-boats had gone missing in the Mediterranean. Based on the wreck's location and design, it could only be U-455. At last, the silence had a name. Further study of the wreck revealed details that suggested its final moments. The submarine's periscope was still extended, frozen in its raised position, a clue that the U-boat had likely been near the surface when disaster struck. The position of the wreck, the sealed hatches, and its upward tilt all hinted at a desperate, failed struggle to rise before the sea claimed it forever. The sea floor revealed that U-455's final moments had been violent and tragic. The stern section was completely smashed, clear evidence of a massive explosion. But what exactly caused it remained uncertain. It could have been the result of a mine hidden in the waters, a depth charge dropped by Allied forces, or even an internal failure within the submarine itself. The ocean gave away only part of the truth and kept the rest locked away. For the families who had lived for decades without answers, the discovery was both devastating and strangely comforting. It confirmed what most had feared, that their loved ones had never escaped, but at the same time it gave them a place to mourn. The wreck was no longer just a rumor or a mystery. It was proof that the men were still together, resting inside the steel chamber that had carried them to their doom. To the untrained eye, the wreck looked like little more than twisted metal and silence. But to divers and historians, every scar on its hull, every broken piece of steel, every angle of its posture told part of a story. The submarine had not simply sunk quietly. It had gone down fighting. Its bow was tilted upward at a steep angle, as if the crew had been desperately trying to force it to the surface in their last moments. Unlike other vessels that rested flat on the seabed, U-455's final position showed a struggle. It was easy to imagine the crew straining to save the boat. Engines roaring, ballast tanks emptied, every man at his station, yet something far more powerful struck, overwhelming their efforts in an instant. The stern damage revealed that the fatal blow was explosive, but the source was unclear. The torn edges of steel seemed to suggest an external blast, but there was no scattered wreckage that would usually follow such a strike. The submarine had gone down as one unit, not ripped apart, which only deepened the mystery. Even the raised periscope painted a chilling picture. It meant the submarine had been close to the surface, scanning for threats or trying to navigate, when disaster struck. The men had not been fleeing or hiding at great depths. They had likely been seconds away from surfacing, unaware of the danger that was about to end their lives. The sealed hatches told perhaps the most haunting part of the story. No one had tried to escape. There had been no attempt to abandon the submarine. The men were locked inside, trapped in the darkness, and 50 lives ended together beneath the waves. To divers who found the wreck, this was the hardest truth to face. They knew that every compartment still sealed within that steel coffin had once held men struggling in vain against their fate. Despite decades underwater, the wreck still carried marks of its identity. Coral and seaweed had covered the steel, but rivets, numbers, and its very shape confirmed it as U-455. These silent details were like pages of a diary, preserved by the sea until discovered again. The once feared predator of the Mediterranean, part of Hitler's grey wolves, no longer looked menacing. Broken, defeated, and sealed tight, the submarine now appeared vulnerable and human. It was no longer a weapon of war but a reminder of the men who had lived and died inside it. For the families, the wreck finally offered some closure. Decades of rumors and speculation gave way to something real. The submarine was no longer just a name on a list of the missing. It was a grave, a place where 50 men had made their last stand. It carried their voices, their struggles, and their silence. But behind the steel, there had once been living, breathing men. Records and naval archives revealed their names, their ages, and fragments of their lives. Among them was their commander, Captain Lieutenant Hans-Heinrich Giesler, born in 1911, a career naval officer known for his calm and steady leadership. His crew, many of them barely out of their teenage years, lived in the claustrophobic steel hull where they ate, slept, and worked in shifts. They shared bunks still warm from the last occupant, endured the constant noise of engines, and wrote letters filled with both longing and fear. Their days blended into monotony, interrupted only by sudden alarms or the thunder of depth charges exploding outside. For them, war was not just a mission, it was their entire existence. Two men had once been part of U-455's crew but were reassigned before its final voyage. They lived long enough to tell fragments of the story, but for the 50 others, the submarine became both their prison and their grave. And now, decades later, the wreck itself tells their story. Silent but powerful, a reminder of the human cost hidden beneath the waves.